What if someone has been secretly counting every good thing you've ever done? And they're about to read the whole list back to you. Because that's exactly what happened to a girl who thought she was worth nothing. She stood in front of the man she loved and told him, straight to his face, "I have nothing to give you." And he looked at her like she just said something completely insane, because he had a list. A long one. And every single item on it was about her. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you might start wondering what's on your list and who's been keeping it. Here's what this video is really about. It's about a woman named Josie who spent her whole life adding herself up and always landing on zero. Not because it was true, because everyone around her had taught her to count the wrong things. And here's why this matters to you, whoever you are watching this right now. Most of us do this. We measure ourselves by what's in our bank account, what's on our resume, what we can point to and hand somebody. And when we come up short, we assume we are short. We assume we're not enough. But there's another way to keep score. And somebody in this story had been keeping that score for 2 whole years without saying a word. So let's go back to a warm evening in the Texas Hill Country, where a poor ranch girl was about to walk away from the best thing that ever happened to her because of some bad math. Picture this. Josie Renner is standing on a porch as the sun goes down, and she's looking at her own hands like they're empty pockets. Because in her mind, that's exactly what they are. She says it plain, no drama, just fact as far as she's concerned. "Caleb, I don't have anything to bring to this. No land. No money. Not $1 saved up. My name doesn't open any doors around here either. You could marry any girl in this county and get a good spread of land thrown in with the wedding. All I've got is me. And me isn't worth much." Now, Caleb Whitlock is standing there listening to this, and here's the thing. He doesn't jump in to argue about land or money or dollars, because he already knows arguing with a number doesn't work. You can't talk math with a feeling. So instead, he does something else. He smiles that easy, sure smile of his, and he says, "Sit down, Josie, because I've been keeping my own count for a while now, and I don't think you know what's on it." She sits, more out of confusion than anything. And that's where this story actually begins. To understand why Caleb said what he said, you've got to rewind and see Josie the way the whole county saw her. She was 25 years old, an orphan. Her mother died when Josie was barely 6, and her father had never really been in the picture to begin with. She was raised, if you could call it that, by a family named the Rennerses, hardworking, hard-up ranch folks who took her in more because they needed an extra pair of hands than because they wanted a daughter. They weren't cruel, but they weren't warm either. They made sure Josie understood, early and often, that a girl with no people and no property had exactly one thing to offer this world, and that thing was work. So she worked. From the time she could walk behind a plow, she worked. She grew up strong, fast, capable, better with cattle and rope than most of the grown men on the place. And by the time she was 25, everything Josie Renner owned in this world fit onto her own back. Except for one thing, a blue shawl. It had belonged to her mother. It was the only piece of her mother Josie had left in the entire world, and she kept it, folded, careful, in a wooden box, only wearing it on Sundays and the coldest nights. If you had to sum up everything Josie owned, her whole estate, if you want to call it that, it started and ended with that shawl. Hold on to that detail. It's going to matter a lot more than you think. Now, here's something you need to understand about the world Josie grew up in. Marriage wasn't just about love. It was about math, and everybody did the math out loud, right in front of each other, like it was completely normal. A girl who brought land to a marriage. Good catch. A girl who brought money. Even better, a girl with a respected family name, worth courting, and a girl who brought none of that. No land, no money, no name. Well, in the plain arithmetic of that county, she wasn't much of a prospect. Didn't matter how kind she was, how hard she worked, how good her heart was. None of that showed up in the sum. Josie heard this kind of talk her entire life. She'd sit quietly while the Renner women gossiped about which local girls were good matches and which weren't, adding up dowries in their heads like they were counting coins. And Josie, being a smart girl, did the same math on herself. Every single time, she landed on zero. So long before Caleb Whitlock ever looked twice in her direction, Josie had already decided something important about her own life. She wasn't the marrying kind. Not because she didn't want a home of her own. She wanted that more than almost anything. But she'd already done the sum, and the sum said, no. So she made her peace with being useful to other people's families instead of building one of her own. She didn't cry about it. She didn't complain. She just believed it, the same quiet way you believe the sun's going to rise. Here's the part that should hit close to home for a lot of people watching this. How many of us have done that exact same math on ourselves? Looked at what we don't have, the job title, the bank balance, the perfect resume, and quietly decided we're not worth pursuing. You'd be surprised how many people are walking around today, carrying Josie's exact same zero. Now let's talk about Caleb, because his side of this story is where it gets interesting. Caleb Whitlock was a rancher's son, set to inherit a good spread of land near the town of Larkspur. By every measure the county cared about, he was a fine catch himself. Which meant, for years, every mother with a marriageable daughter had been steering their girls in his direction. Girls with dowries. Girls with land. Girls who added up to nice, tidy sums. And not one of them interested him even a little bit. He couldn't quite explain why at first. There was just something underneath all their charm that felt calculated. Like they'd already run their own math on him, and were simply waiting to see if the equation balanced. It felt less like courting, and more like two ranches negotiating a merger. Then, about 2 years before this story starts, Caleb started noticing Josie Renner. Not the way he'd noticed the girls with the dowries. Different. And it all started with one small thing that he could not stop thinking about afterward. Here's a way to picture what was happening inside Caleb if it helps imagine somebody quietly opening a savings account in your name without telling you, and every single day they drop something into it. $1 here. $10 there. You don't know the account exists. You've never seen a statement. But 2 years go by, and suddenly there's a small fortune sitting there with your name on it. That's what Caleb was doing. Except instead of dollars, he was depositing moments. Little proofs of exactly who Josie really was. The first deposit came from an old ranch hand named Amos. Amos had worked the Renner spread for 40 years. 40 years of his life given to that place. But he'd gotten old, and then he'd gotten sick. And, in the hard math of that county, an old man who couldn't work anymore was just a mouth to feed, with no working hands attached to it. So they'd moved him out to a little shack at the edge of the property to live out whatever time he had left, mostly forgotten. Nobody visited Amos. Nobody had time for a man who couldn't contribute anymore. That was simply how it worked out there. Nobody except Josie. Every single evening, after a full day of the hardest physical labor on that ranch, when she could have gone straight to bed, exhausted, Josie walked out to Amos's shack instead. She brought him food off her own plate. She sat and listened to the same old stories he told over and over, the way old men do. She kept his little stove burning. She held his hand on the nights that were bad. And she did every bit of this for a dying man who could not do one single thing for her in return. No wages, no favor, nothing. Caleb saw it completely by accident. He'd ridden over on some errand for his father and spotted Josie walking toward that shack in the fading light with a covered plate in her hands. He asked one of the ranch boys what that was about, and the boy just shrugged and said something like, "Oh, that's just Josie. She goes out there every night. Nobody really knows why. Half the time he can't even remember she's there." Caleb sat on his horse and watched a poor ranch girl carry her own dinner out to a man the whole world had already given up on. And something shifted in his chest right then. That was deposit number 1. A few weeks later, a family came through the county. Worse off, if you can believe it, than the renters. A man, his wife, and 3 thin, hungry-looking children in a wagon that had clearly seen better roads. They stopped to ask for water. Josie looked at those 3 kids and disappeared for a minute, then came back out with real food, more than she could reasonably spare, and pushed it into their hands, refusing to take no for an answer. Then, the smallest girl, maybe 5 years old, started shivering in the cool evening air. And Josie took her own coat right off her back and wrapped it around that child, told the mother to keep it, and went cold herself for the rest of the night. Caleb happened to be there again. Different errand, same accidental front row seat. He watched Josie freeze so a stranger's daughter could stay warm. And he made deposit number 2. There was a young man in that county named Petey. Petey's mind hadn't grown up the same way his body had, and the other young folks were merciless about it, the way people can be merciless about anything they don't understand. More than once, Caleb watched Josie physically step between Petey and whoever was mocking him that day. Quiet, but absolutely immovable. At the church dances, she'd take Petey under her wing, dance with him so he wouldn't stand alone against the wall while everyone else laughed. She treated him like a whole human being, the only person in that entire county who did. Petey lit up like a lantern every time Josie walked into a room. And Caleb kept watching and kept adding entries, 3, 4, 5. Because once he actually started paying attention, he realized Josie did this constantly, without thinking about it, without an audience, as natural as breathing. And here's what really pulled Caleb in deeper than anything else. Josie had absolutely no idea she was doing anything special. To the Dowry girls, one public act of kindness was a performance. Something to be arranged, witnessed, remembered, filed away as evidence of good character. To Josie, sitting with a dying old man or freezing so a child could stay warm, or standing up for a boy nobody else would defend. None of that registered as charity at all. It was just Tuesday. She would have been genuinely confused if you'd pulled her aside and called her generous. So Caleb fell for her, not the way he was supposed to fall for someone with land and dowries and matched-up estates. He fell for a poor ranch hand who owned exactly one blue shawl and gave away everything else she had, and didn't even know she was doing anything worth noticing. Over those 2 years, Caleb started finding reasons to be near her, helping with chores that weren't his to help with, walking her home after church, just showing up quietly again and again. And Josie, who had already done her math and landed on 0, could not for the life of her figure out what a man like Caleb Wetlock wanted with a girl like her. Every time his attention got obvious enough that she couldn't pretend not to notice, she'd pull back and recite her math out loud. "I don't have anything to offer you, Caleb. You should be courting a girl with land. You're wasting yourself on somebody with empty pockets." She said some version of that more times than she could count over those 2 years. And every single time, Caleb wanted to sit her down right then and read her the account he'd been keeping. The one that told a completely different story about her worth. But he waited. He couldn't have told you exactly why. He was waiting, it turned out, for one final entry. The one that would finally make the account too big for even Josie to argue with. That last entry came in the winter of the 2nd year, and it cost Josie the one thing she owned in this world. Old Amos died that winter. He died in that little shack in the cold, with Josie holding his hand, because she'd gone out there that night, same as she had nearly every night for 2 years straight. And Amos, at the very end, had almost nothing to leave behind, because he'd spent 40 years working for other people, and had nothing saved for himself. But even a poor forgotten man needs burying, a decent grave, a stone with his name cut into it. And the Renner family wasn't about to pay for a proper send-off for an old hand who couldn't work anymore. That was just their arithmetic. Amos was headed for an unmarked hole at the edge of the county burial ground, forgotten the same way he'd lived his final years, unless somebody stepped in. Josie had no money. She'd never had money in her whole life. But she had one thing of value in the entire world. She had her mother's blue shawl, so she took it, the only thing she owned, the last piece of her mother she had left, and she carried it into Larkspur and sold it to a shopkeeper's wife who'd always admired it. And with that money, she bought Amos a real burial, a proper stone, his name carved into it for good. Remember that shawl? The one precious thing Josie owned in this entire world. She sold it to bury a forgotten old man who would never know she'd done it and could never once thank her for it. That's the entry that finished the account. Because giving away money you don't need is generous. But giving away the one irreplaceable thing you own for someone who can't even know you did it, that's something a lot rarer than generous. There isn't really a word for it in Josie's ledger of land and dowries. But there was exactly one word for it in Caleb's. Caleb found out about the shawl by accident, same as he found out about everything Josie did. The shopkeeper's wife mentioned, in passing, what a lovely blue shawl she'd bought off the Renner girl. And wasn't it a shame the poor thing had to give up her only keepsake. And did he know she'd used the money to give old Amos a proper burial? Caleb stood in that shop and understood, right then, that the account he'd been keeping for 2 years had just crossed a line it could never come back from. The waiting was over. But before he could act, Josie nearly ruined everything with one final round of bad math. At a church gathering that same winter, a woman named Mrs. Aldridge, self-appointed matchmaker of the county, with a marriageable daughter of her own, pulled Josie aside and told her, in that sugary voice people use when they're being cruel and calling it kindness, that Josie really shouldn't keep encouraging young Caleb Wetlock. That it wasn't fair to him. That a girl with nothing had no business tying down a man with his prospects. That the truly decent thing to do, the kind thing, would be for Josie to step back and let Caleb marry someone who could actually bring something to the marriage. And Josie, who had spent her whole life being kind, heard this and believed it, because it matched perfectly with the math she'd always done on herself. So that's why she went to Caleb that evening. Not to fight for him, to let him go. She'd decided the most generous thing she could possibly do was hand him back to someone worthy and remove herself from his path. She'd even managed to turn giving him up into one more act of giving, sacrificing her own heart's wish for what she believed was his good. That's how deep that wrong math had gone in her. She couldn't imagine she had anything to offer, so she offered the one thing she thought she had left her absence. Which brings us right back to where we started. Josie looking at her own empty hands, telling Caleb she had nothing. And that's when Caleb, who'd been keeping his account for 2 years and had just heard the final entry confirmed in a shop that very same day, decided Josie was going to hear the whole thing out loud, entry by entry, whether she believed it yet or not. "You've read me your account for 2 years now," he told her. "Everything you don't have. Now you're going to sit still and hear mine, because I've been keeping one too, and mine's a lot longer than yours." And he read it to her. Entry 1. Amos. 2 years. You carried your own supper out to a dying man who couldn't give you a single thing back. Every evening, after a full day of work, when you could have rested. Nobody asked you to, nobody even knew, except by accident. That's not nothing, Josie. Where I come from, that might be the biggest thing a person can do. Entry 2. That family passing through, 3 hungry kids in a broken down wagon. You gave them food you couldn't spare and the coat off your own back. And you went cold. And you thought so little of it, I bet you've nearly forgotten it happened. I haven't. Entry 3. PT. Every social for years. You've stood between that boy and whoever was mocking him. Danced with him so he wouldn't stand alone. Treated him like a whole man when the whole county treated him like a punchline. You know what that's worth to him? Everything. You know what it's worth to me? More than any dowry in this county. By this point, Josie was sitting perfectly still, eyes filling up, because she had never once heard any of this said out loud, and hearing it named was doing something to the math she'd carried her entire life. And entry 4, Caleb said, quieter now. The blue shawl, your mother's shawl, the last thing you had of her in this whole world. You sold it, Josie. You sold the last piece of your mother to buy a forgotten old man a real grave and a stone with his name on it, knowing he'd never thank you, knowing nobody would ever find out. I only know because I found out by accident, same as I find out everything. Because you never tell a living soul. His voice cracked a little there. You sat there tonight and told me you have nothing to offer. Josie Renner, you have spent 2 years giving away everything you have to everyone who needed it. And you've done it so quiet and so constant you can't even see it happening. You've been rich this whole time. You just kept your account in the wrong column. Josie put her face in her hands and, for the first time in this whole story, she cried. Because the sum she'd carried her entire life, the one that always landed on zero, was being ripped up right in front of her and rewritten. And it was almost more than she could stand. Those are just things anybody would do, she managed to say through her hands. No, Caleb said, gently pulling her hands down so she'd look at him. That's exactly the point. Almost nobody does them. And you do them without even noticing, which is the rarest thing there is. Because it means it's coming from something real in you, not from wanting anybody to see it. This whole county measures a bride by her land and her dowry and her name. That's a fool's way to measure anyone. I've watched the girls with all 3 of those things, and there's nothing behind their eyes. And I've watched you with none of it. Give away your coat, and your supper, and your own mother's shawl, and I wouldn't trade you for every ranch in this state. You keep saying you have nothing to offer. Josie Renner, you have the kindest heart in Texas, and that's the one fortune that never runs dry and never lies to you. Marry me. Not so I can save you. So I can spend the rest of my life keeping the one honest account anybody's ever kept on you. Josie Renner. The orphan girl who'd done her math and landed on 0 for 25 straight years. Looked at Caleb Whitlock and finally let herself believe a different number. It was, without question, the hardest thing she'd ever done. Harder than sitting with a dying man. Harder than walking that shawl into town and handing it over. Because it meant unlearning the one thing she'd been most certain of her entire life, that she wasn't worth much. But Caleb had laid the account out so plainly, entry by entry, that even Josie couldn't argue with the total anymore. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Caleb. Though I still don't half believe you. That's fine, he said. I'll read you the account every single day until you do. I've got a lifetime of entries saved up, and I'm still adding new ones. They were married that spring in the little church outside Larkspur, and the whole county showed up, including Petey, who cried happy tears through the entire ceremony. And in a manner of speaking, old Amos was there too. His good stone with his name carved into it stood right there in the churchyard, where everybody could see it. Bought and paid for with a blue shawl. A handful of people in that county knew that story, and none of them ever forgot it. And here's the part Caleb did quietly. Right before the wedding, because 2 years of watching Josie had taught him her own quiet ways. He rode into Larkspur and found the shopkeeper's wife, and he bought back the blue shawl, paid a good deal more for it than Josie had ever gotten selling it. And the shopkeeper's wife, who wasn't a bad woman at all, let it go gladly once she understood why. On their wedding morning, Caleb handed Josie back her mother's shawl. The last piece of her mother. The one thing she'd given away for a stranger. Well, not quite a stranger, a forgotten friend, who could never thank her for it. It came back to her that morning, from the hands of the one person who'd watched her give it up and understood exactly what it had cost her. Josie held that shawl and couldn't say a word. "You gave away the last of your mother for a dead man's grave," Caleb told her. "A woman who does that should never have to go without her mother's shawl again. It's yours, and it's staying yours." Josie cried again, the good kind this time, and wore that shawl at her own wedding. They built a long, good life together on that ranch in the hill country. And Josie never once stopped giving things away, because that's simply who she was. Caleb never once tried to stop her, because he'd married her exactly for that reason. Over the years, the Whitlock Ranch became known as the place a person could go when they had absolutely nowhere else. Where a hungry family got fed, a lost soul got a roof, and a forgotten old hand got a proper grave. Because the woman running that house kept an open hand, same as she always had. Only now she finally had the means to match her heart. And every so often, of an evening, Caleb would find Josie wrapped up in her mother's blue shawl, and he'd sit down next to her, and she'd still say, a little wondering even after all those years, "I never did have anything to offer you, Caleb." And Caleb Whitlock would smile that same slow, sure smile from the very first evening, and he'd say, "Josie Whitlock, you've offered me the kindest heart in Texas every single day of my life. I've been keeping the account. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If somebody has secretly been keeping a list on you, not the list of your job title or your bank balance or what you post online, but the real list, every small kindness, every quiet sacrifice nobody saw, what would be written on it? Because here's what this story is really telling you. The world will always try to measure you by what you can hand over. Your paycheck, your title, your RA sum A. And if you let that be the only ruler you use, you'll do exactly what Josie did. You'll walk around believing you've got nothing to offer, when the truth is you've been rich the entire time. You just had your account in the wrong column. So maybe it's time to open the right one. Start noticing the things you give away without even thinking about it. Because somebody out there is noticing. And one day, somebody might just sit you down and read it back to you. If this one hit you the way it hit me, drop a comment and tell me what's on your ledger. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe. I've got a lot more entries where this one came from.